Welcome to 112th episode of Silver Lining for Learning. This is the time for the host to reflect. And each one of us, Chris Dede of Harvard, Kurt Bunk of Indiana University, Punya Mishra of Arizona State University, Yung Zhao of University of Kansas and the University of Melbourne. We're going to share our reflections over the past episodes, but also some of our comments. We haven't done this for really 2 weeks. We didn't do last episode. So it feels kind of strange to be back, and I feel like I missed something really important. And also this last 2 weeks, many things have happened. Really, many things have happened in this country, in the United States of America, in many other countries. This is a very, very uncertain time for all of us in education. And so I will, ask Chris Dede to start, to say what you would like to share, what you would like to talk about.
So I would like to see a new universal audit for graduation put in place, that every student from every educational institution is asked 3 questions when it's time for graduation. And if they can't answer the 3 questions well, then it's an indictment, not of the student, it's a terrible indictment of the educational institution. So the first question is, when you encounter someone who is different than you are, is that frightening or is that exciting to you? In other words, are you xenophobic or are you xenophilic? Because a tremendous amount of the problems in the world today are caused by people being xenophobic. And yes, I think that diversity, equity, and inclusion are important, but in a way, those are symptoms of an underlying cause, and the underlying cause is fear of people who are different than you. The second question would be, when you're in a place that's unfamiliar and people are behaving in ways that are different than you're used to, is that frightening to you or is that exciting to you? So this is applying the same thing to culture, if you will, and context. Are you the kind of person who travels somewhere that they've never been? And Kurt would be the outstanding example of this, because you're so intrigued by being in different contexts and cultures. Or, the minute that you get past even your part of town, are you frightened? And when I was at the University of Houston, Clear Lake, many years ago, Galveston Island is about 50 miles south of that. It's a relatively small island. I mean, it has a city on it, but there's maybe 50,000 people there. I met adults when I went to Galveston who had never been off the island and had no desire to ever be off the island. No desire to go to Houston, 50 something miles away. And the third question would be, do you believe that you're dependent on the success of others for your own success and happiness? Because there's a Darwinian notion now that I think is very prevalent, that if I just am completely selfish and I'm smart and I'm aggressive, I can end up having a wonderful life. And, the counter position would be, yes, I'm happy to pay school taxes even though I don't have children, because I understand that educating other people's children is important to my own well-being. And I think that what we're seeing in the world today is evidence of the fact that education, by and large, is failing badly on all three of those questions. And that if you go all the way down to underlying causes about the mess that we're in, a lot of it is based on failing on those three fundamental things. So I guess I'm proposing a different set of curriculum standards than what we have right now, and maybe a different form of examination. So there's my reflection for what it's worth.
All right, thanks, Chris. I think
So I want to
those
just
are
follow
important
up.
questions. Punya, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on what Chris has been talking about, because it seems to me that what you are asking for is like a fundamental rethinking of how we have been thinking about education so far and what the goals of it are. And I think, Zhao, you've talked about sort of this idea of the global citizenship, because I think that's what you're sort of, at least with the first two, you're getting at is a recognition of the fact that we are deeply interconnected. There is no way out of that. And if we still maintain this Stone Age mindset of othering and not being willing to explore and not see meeting other people as a broadening of our horizon, but rather something to be scared of, that's a fundamental shift in how we would think about the role of education in society. So I think that's one point. The second one, with the sort of the individual versus sort of collective, a recognition of that, I mean, it could not have become more salient than through the COVID pandemic, where the idea of putting on a mask was seen as an imposition rather than as something that you do not for yourself. You actually do it for others. And that in itself would become such a lightning rod. I think, it spoke to why what you're suggesting is that important. But I also feel that, and Zhao, before the show started, we talked a little bit about what's happening globally. And Zhao, you were talking about China, and then if I look at what's going on in India, I mean, the level at which historical classroom textbooks are being rewritten, where history is being reframed in completely the opposite direction of what you are suggesting, Chris. Instead of a more outward looking, a global sort of a sense, it is a very jingoistic, it's a very narrow definition of what it means to be Indian, or, and so on. So yes, I think the points are very well taken. It's just that I feel, even if we just look at the last 2 weeks and some of the decisions that have come down from the Supreme Court and sort of the broader January 6th insurrection and all of those things playing out, that all the trends seem to be moving in the other direction, which makes the point that you're making all the more important and salient. But I think in the last few times, whenever we had these reflections, I have been a bit of a Debbie Downer. I've been very pessimistic about the trends that I see overall. And this doesn't help make me any more optimistic, honestly, right now. So yeah, just wanted to add my 2 cents to that.
Kurt, sorry, I have to jump in here, is that surprisingly, the US may look very depressing, but surprisingly, at least you can protest. In many other countries, at this moment, for all kinds of reasons, you're not even allowed to voice dissenting voices. I think that's very troublesome. I mean, in the US, you still have some risk, but at the same time, it's possible that is typically you don't go to jail or you don't just disappear. I think that's an important message. Second thing, I think what you guys are talking about gets me very worried is that schools are not allowed to have students engage in conversations in this, because otherwise, in this country, you'll see the school boards collapsing. You have all kinds of problems. Like, children are not actually engaged in this cultural wars or discussions or ideological things. And then how do we expect them to develop more rational way of having conversations? Because you look at the schools today are very much at a very culturally sensitive point. So we bring our children, we teach them math, we teach them reading, but none of this, really significant human issues are in schools. But when schools are supposed to prepare our future generation, you know, all the people who promote 21st century skills, you know, growth mindset, whatever they promote, the curriculum, like Chris was saying, the standards is we have to have citizens who are more able and who are able to have conversations and determine where the future of humanity should be. You know, I think that is quite troublesome. You know, in essence, we're repeating what happened during, you know, 1914, you know, or during all that time now, you know, all these countries get into war, fighting each other, and the nonsensical patriotism is really happening in different parts of the world. So that is actually, Chris, your question is fabulous, but Punya's talking about it also is very worrisome. I'm sorry, Kurt, I jumped in.
Oh, I'm going to jump in with one more thing before we move on. I'm sorry, Chris, you ignited something here, so I'm going to blame you for it. I think that given this, there's a piece in The Economist today, which is talking about school closures across the globe during the pandemic. And the numbers are staggering. So if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, 90% of 10-year-old children cannot read. And that's actually grown over the past 2 years. If you look at all low to middle income countries, the rise has been from around, I'm looking at the data right here, from around 58% to around 70%. And so while we are facing these incredible challenges, we are facing this radicalization, this polarization, the jingoism, the xenophobia, all of those things, and the increasing sort of pressure on not allowing students to talk about X or Y, I think there are also increasing number of students who are not even being given the basic tools to be able to even engage in that conversation. So I think the layers of this are very important for us to be thinking about as well. Sorry, Kurt, on to you, and I promise to keep shut and not interrupt for a few minutes.
Well, there's 112 shows in. I finally have a microphone that will work if I look this way or that way, but I really don't like this. Might be the only show I have with this microphone. So bear with me, anyone who's watching the recording, okay? I was going to start with a different point, but given the way Chris started us off here today, I'm going to go to my second point, which is this morning at 7:30 a.m. in the USA Eastern Time, at 11:30 at night in New Zealand, we had a book launching for my book, Transformative Teaching Around the World, finally, because people are getting the book 4 or 5 months later. Long story about the shipping from Rutledge. But anyways, they're very happy to come in and chat from all around the world. You know, I just said, let's have a book launching and let's figure out when everybody can meet on a Saturday, you know, because the course was called the famous Saturday class for 5 hours. So here we are on a Saturday with 60 people and about at least 16 of the authors of the 45 representing, we had 20 to 24 countries in the session, and including 2 deans, my current dean, Stacy Maroney, and my former dean, Gerardo Gonzalez, showed up as well. So it was a real community feel. And that's how I ended the show. I said, hey, you know, you're part of 4 families. They're all people who attended Indiana University, were there as employees or students. Number 2, they were all part of the School of Ed family. Number 3, they're in my R546 class. Everybody who contributed to the book was in the class. And number 4, you know, they're all part of the book now. So there are 4 different families, and now they're all part of the video that we created. So we have to think about, if we want people to reach out and connect with other people in diverse parts of the world, what are ways that we can create families and communities? You know, a common video series like this podcast show is being listened to afterwards by a lot of people who download it later. And like I did during this week, I listened to a show. You know, there are ways to create community by building identity with Silver Lining for Learning, our identity with the Transformative Teaching Around the World book, or other forms of identification or common histories. My students might have a common history of coming at 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning to attend Punk's class for 5 hours. That's identity. They survived. They survived. I remember the first online class I taught, my students created, I survived Dr. Punk's online class back in 1997. It's all fun and jest, but they're having a good time with it and passing around t-shirts and whatnot. There's a t-shirt, it's just a t-shirt, but it was something that they could rally around, rethink about, discuss, have that identity. So, building a common history, building identity or experiences, something to remember, a common membership that one has in this community, in this family, as I was calling it today, but in this community of learners or of educators or whatever you're working with. And it has to be a place where you're not only getting something from that community, going to it for maybe someone's posting a set of links for you to download, but also you're giving to that community. So it has to be both something that you can be providing and feeling some sense of pride or some sense of meaning or purpose, Man's Search for Meaning book, as well as, getting something from the community. So give and get. There are many other aspects to building a successful learning community. And again, we in our new article that came out a month or two back, I outlined a little bit of that in the article about how we can community. But a lot of us educators have to think about how are we creating communities within our class, within our programs, within our schools and colleges, within our institutions, and then beyond life, within our informal learning settings that we're all in. And we're all in a number of informal learning settings, but how can we help sustain, maintain, grow, promote the community, the various communities that we are starting up, as well as joining that someone else has created. So life, memories are in our lived connections. And today, this morning, for an hour, we went an hour and a half, actually, no one wanted to leave. It's really fascinating. It was everyone, goodbye. We actually had a rocket ship lift off the book. I had my assistant create a space shuttle liftoff for the book. But it's really, we felt each other's needs, passions, meanings, and purposes during that 1 hour and a half session, a long session. And this was a way for people in Indonesia, Malaysia, Taiwan, Singapore, India, New Zealand, Mexico, Morocco, Finland, UK, USA, Canada, all connecting. There are more countries than that, Costa Rica. This is a way in which we were all instantaneously feeling connected to each other and sharing with each other. The chat was just exploding, even though I'd never met before. So having a common purpose, having a goal, having a shared mission. So I'll offer, unlike Young, I'll offer the optimistic side of what's going on today. I saw something happening there. It's just, it was delight. It's like delight to see the way in which people were sharing their communities, their customs, their cultures, their ideas, their educational settings, and their pedagogies, respective pedagogies in different countries, from China to Korea to the others to Europe. And so that was truly an exciting experience. I'll end with that, Young.
Punya, go ahead.
Yeah, so having beat the pessimist drum, let me do the optimist side, because Kurt, and Kurt, you mentioned this right when you started, about that you watched this episode, that this sort of a bonus episode that we ended up having. And so I just wanted to let the listeners know that Silver Lining for Learning was invited to this conference organized by ShapingEDU, which is a global community of around 4,000 educators, students, researchers, storytellers, creators from across the world. And Kurt, sadly, because you were at EdMedia presenting, you couldn't make it, but Chris and Zhao and I presented there. The video for that is now on the website. And it was kind of fun to share sort of all these different things that we've learned over the past 2 years. So again, not to be utterly pessimistic, because I think part of what this show has been about is finding that silver lining. And I think that over the past 2 years, we've really talked with some amazing people. And that was an opportunity to share their stories. Really, it was us not talking about ourselves or the show much, but really about people or organizations that, episodes that we have had in the past that have really moved and inspired us. So yes.
About that Punya, the 30,000 views and the 150 guests. If we were each teaching a class trying to do that, it would take us years, to have those 150 people. The four of us have all learned from those 150 people. It's been our professional development that's been going on every week. So people I say, you're giving a lot here within Silver Lining. No, we're getting a lot from it as well. Everyone that Young and Punya and Chris and Scott McLeod before that have brought into the show, I'm fascinated in learning something from, whether they're graduate students or have created some unique idea and experience to people who, have been in the field for 40 years. Every one of them has been a fascinating show. And so, and people are going to learn from these years afterwards because they'll exist in a database. They'll be available. And I know the last question or second last question you were asked in the show 2 weeks ago at Space Camp was, how can people utilize these shows? What are the impacts that they're making? And, I was thinking to myself, I was jogging yesterday, listening to the broadcast, or maybe it's today, actually this morning, I was listening to the broadcast and, and Punya, I listened to your part twice, and Chris as well. And then I ran out of time. Sorry, Young, I only listened to your part once. But, I could have listened to that 3 or 4 times and learned something each time through, And so there are ways in which people can have students reflect and listen and write reflection types of papers on various shows, common themes, common interests, and so forth. I found the data that you presented fascinating, Punya. I really, really enjoyed that. I'm going to make a comment on what Chris has said later in the show. I got a couple things I want to say about that. Chris, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I want to try to synthesize some of the things that everyone has been saying. And I'll recount a little personal history. When I was young, in my teens, let's say, I read a tremendous amount of stuff. And one of the things that influenced me most was George Orwell's 1984. And at the time, I saw it as kind of a chilling look at what might have been if somehow the Soviet Union had prevailed and similar totalitarian regimes had prevailed. And then later, when 1984 actually rolled around, I viewed it as kind of an over-the-top way of pointing out some issues in society that were important. But today, if he just titled it 2020 instead of 1984, he would have been right on target. I noted in the news that there are educators in Texas, quote, educators, unquote, in Texas, who want to replace the term slavery in textbooks with involuntary relocation. If that isn't the Ministry of Truth from 1984, which could be labeled as one of the major news companies. I'm trying not to be too ideological, so I won't say which seems to me to be trying to act like the Ministry of Truth, but viewers may recognize the reference. It's really scary. Now, Orwell paints a bleak picture in the book. He does not present a happy ending, but the reason the book was influential for me is I said to myself, and I think thoughtful readers say to themselves, education is the only way out of this. And yet, as Yang pointed out, educational systems are falling under the iron hand of groups that want to suppress true education across many parts of the world. And the pandemic and similar disruptions are creating a lot of no education even when there may not be a deliberate attempt to suppress education. So that is really scary. Those two things are really scary. And then I go to what Curtis said, the one, thank God, optimistic thing that's come out in the program so far. When formal education is disabled for reasons that we've been discussing, you've got to have communities that of learning and practice and community that exist outside of the formal educational system. And Silver Lining for Learning is an example. And Kurt, the things that you're doing and talking about are an example. All of us, in our own ways are trying to create things like that. But they're becoming more and more and more important because it's less and less possible to rely on formal education, at least at this point in history. And so thinking about how we strengthen that part of things and maybe inviting guests that really focus on those things, and I know, Jan, you've championed that a lot, is a direction that we should consider.
Chris, I know Punya wants to jump in. There's so many things I want to react, but I will let Punya go first, and then I will react because this is it's become one of our very most interesting episodes now. Okay, Punya, go ahead.
Yeah. So, Chris, just as you, when I was a teenager, I used to read a lot and read 1984. I also, at that same time, read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which had a different version of a dystopian fiction, which is a different kind of a dystopian world that he had thought of. And what's interesting to me, I was actually thinking about this a little while back, I wanted to write about it, was that we have in some weird way ended up in a mixture of both. So if you think about 1984, then you have this all-powerful state, which, that think of humanity as being a foot grinding you into your face forever, right? And then in Aldous Huxley's, we have this world, which is this hedonistic world where everybody is tapped into some kind, they're drinking soma, and then they have where procreation has been separated from the sex, and then you're getting these, I don't know, the feelies. And if I think about how we have created these devices, which have been deliberately programmed to be addictive in nature, with using very foundational psychological behavioral sort of structures, and I think wow. And then exactly the point that you said about, how can we redefine slavery to be something else so that it becomes a much more neutral bureaucratic term. So I think we are living in this weird combination of if it's like Huxley and Orwell mated and produced this baby. You know what I mean? So I just find that, so I just had to share that because it was funny. I'd been thinking about these two books a little while ago, and sort of finding that each of them got something right, and the combination is actually scarier than each of them individually in some ways. So thank you for that.
Well, I have to tell you, I was not even allowed to read 1984 in China. When I was growing up, there was no such a book. I didn't even know. So I read that book actually after I came to the US. I read A Brave New World. I watched the movie. I think there's a third book that's very interesting. That's also describes a dystopian society. That's called meritocracy. It's also come out of England. So it was really a joke about it's a horrible idea to do, to assign people to different wealth, different positions based on so-called merit. But now meritocracy has become the legal, the accepted, the conventional way in the US. We proudly pronounce we are doing a meritocracy. We have a meritocracy as if we can truly rank people based on that. This is actually a very horrible idea. I'm writing a book. I was dealing with the issue called achievement gap, for example. The achievement gap is manufactured by the system, and then we force ourselves to close it. It's just really, it's really, one of the worst ideas. It's just to kind of think about it. So think about the whole process. I think what right now, I don't think. I've been questioning schooling for a long time. Schools do not liberate people necessarily. You know, readings, access to information may do, but the way we manage schools, you know, for the past, just think about 20 years, our education reforms, what do they focus on? Standardized testing on reading and math. Really, that was just as if schools is only going to do that. We have nothing to do with humanity, with human beings, with, you know, with thinking. We just want to make sure you can read, make sure you can do math, and not even do real math or do real reading. Is you can pass the math and reading test. If you look at this, I mean, our children have become much less, you know, courageous in challenging social issues, in questioning what is wrong with our society. So Chris, I mean, when you raise those questions, you know, I'm really impressed. So what is something, you know, got to me think about, at least I'm able to read 1984 here, you know, without being prosecuted. You know, there was another book, I have to say, it's called The Selfish Gene, was also banned, you know, in China. We just, you know, I read all these books after I came here, you know, just, it's really interesting.
Funny.
Yeah, it was banned, you know, because.
But so this is the interesting thing in India. What happens is, like, books do get banned, but then I would go and buy that book for 2 rupees at a pavement seller.
So you can do that in India, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
I remember buying. I remember buying like Salman Rushdie's, not Midnight Children, the other one. I'm forgetting the one that got banned, that he had the fatwa against him. You could buy that book on the pavement, but legally you couldn't buy it in a bookstore.
So this is what I think schools, honestly, with the so-called common core state standards, better curriculum, better arrangement, and I think these are all kind of silly ideas to deactivate individuals as possible citizens who can engage in the social discourse. You know, that is, I think that's another thing I just want to react to, Punya, is that, you know, now we live in a globalized society, but a lot of times when we talk about education, we ignore students you mentioned in Africa, actually in many countries, that we ignore them. We pretend education is what we write about here, is, you know, is that what we are trying to do. You know, with this increasing divide, wealth gap, income gap, education gap, digital gap, all these gaps, I wonder where humanity is going to end. Where is humanity? It's again, this is not a joke. Many people have asked me since I'm getting old to say, should I have children? I said, no, you know, the next 20 years will be horrible. And the next 30 years might get even worse. You know, I'm hoping we're getting better, but this is actually all this educational issues, because children do spend time in front of us, do spend time growing up. What are we going to do?
Zhao, you're not getting old. Because I'm at the upper end of middle age, so it's impossible that you could consider yourself as getting old.
Well, he has one advantage, that his name is young, so he is forever young.
Right.
You know, that's not ever going to change. So, Chris, there's a comment from Dodzy, who is on our YouTube chat, which I just posted on our chat, which is that he liked your questions that you raised right at the beginning, and would love for us to dig into the kind of fear difference or diversity may cause. I don't know if anybody, or Chris, if you have any comments.
I actually have a question for Kurt that speaks directly to this. So Kurt, when I think about people I know who are xenophilic and who love being in places with different cultures and contexts, I mean, you come to mind is a mild way of putting this. What can you identify what in your personal life led you to have these very desirable attitudes that I'm saying hopefully we could have everybody graduate with?
And you're from Milwaukee, remember, Kurt. You got to remember that. That's a great cosmopolitan city, I'm sure you know.
Well, it's much more than drinking the beer, let's say. And I was thinking about, you know, you said 1984 and Brave New World. And Chris and I both went to high school in Milwaukee. I went to West Dallas Nathan Hale High School. And there, my high school English teacher, her name is Karen Postenbach. She had us read both of those books. And she was very influential on me and to get us to think deeply and critically analyze and all this stuff. But my other teacher in history and humanities that I had 3 years in a row, I mentioned him a few weeks ago on this show, Dr. Kim, or I don't know if he got his doctorate, but Kim Rody is his name. He actually ended up at Wisconsin Whitewater, where I was as an undergraduate. He was taking courses as a graduate student in religion, Eastern religion thought, as I was the only undergraduate accounting major taking courses in Eastern religion thought. But he was a deep influencer on me because he brought different cultures in the world into the classroom, and he took us outside the classroom. He took us to synagogues and mosques and brought Indian gurus in for meditational activities, and just he pushed the envelope. He pushed us beyond what was the norms, and I really was intrigued by that. And maybe I had that within me before those experiences, but I would definitely say the high school experiences in English class, in history classes, basically humanities 1 and 2, because it was about culture, it was about freedom, it was about choice, it was about thinking deeply about ideas that one cares about and sharing those with one another, collaboration around those ideas and making meaning within and among those ideas. I'd say both those teachers did that to some degree. Mr. Rody, Mr. Kim Rody did it every day. It was an everyday unique experience walking into his classroom on what we're going to do next. But the other thing that happened in the high school was having international exchange students who I befriended. And I was probably the only one sitting at the lunch table with them, talking to them and finding out. I wanted to hear what life was like for them. And so it started there with the international exchange programs and in the humanities classes and so forth. And I will say the other remembrance that I have from 1984 is listening to David Bowie and Rebel Rebel and Diamond Dogs. So the music in American culture is probably much different than in Chinese culture. It opens up a young person to alternative views of the world that they may not be getting in the classroom, may open them up to ways to think about their futures and what they can contribute to them. That young, I think, would be different than what you experienced in China. I hate to say I know, but I'm pretty darn sure it is. So, those are a couple. I think the music and I think the attitude that both I found in English. So in English and in humanities, the math teacher I remember because he said, "Kurt, you're the best B+ student I ever had in geometry." I mean, that's the way math is. And it's not about freedom or culture or choice or deep thinking or meaningfulness. It's about the numbers and the scores and all that kind of stuff. And I gave that up when I left the field of accounting. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, Chris, or if you want to respond to that.
Well, Kurt, I did not have any access to music other than kind of long-lived Chairman Mao, all those things, and Water Buffalo Moose, that I did not really have any access to. So that's why today I still don't listen to music. I really used to think I could have become a much great musician, but never had access to it. So I joke about it. I said I could have become the Justin Bieber, but that's not possible anymore. But there's something what you mentioned about access to information, to books. So technically, if you think of all of us are into technology, and technically everybody could have access to this information, but why don't people access them? That's another challenge. Even in China now, the access into outside information, like say, for example, the Washington Post may be banned, but there are people, using VPN climb over. But why are some people able to or interested in seeking that information? Why others are willing to be fooled? Even like social media, it's another, like in this country, people like to buy into one set of ideas and they just believe that and they don't question why. I still think, your teachers in high school helped you but why aren't there more teachers helping others to grow out of that? You know, that is what I actually interested in. But also what the another thing was, I think Chris' question and Daz's question is interesting. You know, just think about this, the kind of fear. Why are we afraid of something that's different? I have to tell this. When I was growing up in my little tiny village in China, my next village, now I go back, my next village is less than half a mile away, but that was considered enemy. You know, our kids would never walk in there. I mean, it's all freaking Chinese people, you know, they just go back there. I mean, we would not cross into that territory. And now it's raining like less than half a mile away. It's just like it's another enemy state. And those people would sometimes come to my village to get water from our well when their water dries out. But we were afraid of them. I mean, I said, I don't know why. I mean, just it's strange, you know. So I mean, I think normal interaction matters. But I don't remember my village kids interact with those kids. Even if we did, we threw rocks at each other. But that was really just a tiny thing. Remember, we're all Chinese from a tiny place, a half a mile away. It's just really strange. We just had that perspective. I think we need to think about it. The same thing, like in the same neighborhood. Why do we shoot people? Why don't we just, you know, as we're suspicious of some churches, why don't we just go in there, just take a look, check it out? But we don't do those kind of things. It's really, really interesting. I know, you know, Indiana University, I don't know who your kind of basketball enemy is, but you might have, you know, Indiana State, you know, just to combat with. But we have
Kentucky.
kind of things, right? Which one?
Kentucky and Purdue, both of them.
All right. Okay. So yeah, that's that. Yeah. All right. Chris, Pune, want to jump in?
It's funny, we're having this side chat here on the YouTube channel with Edgar and Dodsey, and we are sharing stories about how we got to read books when we were younger. And Edgar said that it's always secondhand books, and mine was like, yep, secondhand books. But there were three amazing sources because I lived in Delhi, which was the capital, which was the British Council Library, the USIS Library, and there used to be these amazing books, particularly around science and math, which were published by the Soviet Union, and a publisher called Mir Publishers, which I don't think exists anymore. Phenomenal books. I still have some of their books with me on my shelves here because I treasure them so much. But it was the British Council and the USIS libraries and books on the pavement. You know, they're just lying there. You just look through, and for 2 or 5 rupees, you would find some amazing literature. That's, you know, I read all my science fiction that way, and I had a pretty good collection of science fiction, but off the pavement. So anyway, there's a side story going on, conversation going on there, and Edgar is insulting me by saying I'm very young. So
all right, Kurt.
Well, Edgar was with me this morning at my book launch, and so was Dodsey. So thanks, Dodsey and Edgar, for coming back for more. They've had an interesting day of reflection on education, both the positives and the challenges, and there are many. And as we had Edgar on the show previously, and we've had Dodsey on the show previously, we realize there's a lot of challenges in Puerto Rico, an endless array. But Edgar remains optimistic when I talk to him. He remains thinking about what the possibilities are. And I guess he's got a new collaboration with people in Europe that's going on. I forget what country he mentioned this morning. But I want to reflect on what Chris had to say in your Space Camp talk a couple of weeks ago. I found his start of that kind of an interesting way to start when he said, we're not in Kansas anymore, we're in Oz. And we're in Oz because we're moving to really hybrid or blended forms of learning, and with myriad stripes attached to them. And many teachers are struggling with that. Some are not. And what prepared those that were successful to be more confident in their approaches to online or / blended high flex models of teaching and learning? And what are the challenges that the others are still facing, that they gave up or resisting? What can we do to help people move into this new era, because we're not going back to traditional ways of instruction. Always blended or hybrid models, as Chris pointed out, will always be with us. But I reflect on my time in New York City 2 weeks ago when you guys were doing that show. Excellent show, by the way. If anyone didn't watch or listen to that show, but you should, because you'll get a sense of the history, just like reading our article in the Journal of Digital Politics will give you this sense of history of the 2 years of the show. But I went to, there you got it. So I went to the show Wicked when I was in New York. And if you think about that, it's got Oz, but it's got the prehistory. It's got the storyline prior to the movie. And I wonder if we could share with educators, with teachers who are in the trenches, who are struggling with blended forms of learning or fully online forms of learning, or all the various combinations thereof, the prehistory to all of this. You know, in 2006, I had the Handbook of Blended Learning. There were dozens and dozens of success models that were in New Zealand or the UK or US or Mexico, all around the world. People were struggling and dealing with and coming up with approaches. But what happened? This is 2006. You know, it's now 16 years later. What's happened to make people still unsure of their approaches or resistant to what the possibilities are? If education was a success, and we'd have ways to implement all the various forms or models or frameworks for blended learning, because there were every chapter, we had 39 chapters, and there was a different model in each chapter. There's no one model of blended or hybrid learning or high flex learning. There are many strikes. We had Brian Beatty on, in fact, one show talking about high flex learning with 2 or 3 of his teachers around the USA. So I'll post it to Chris. If you made the same comment, but then reflect on the wicked, take the wicked view to that, and have the prehistory. What would you do? How would you educate people about the online learning space prior to COVID? What would you tell them, or what could we do to help ramp people up, Chris?
Yeah, I'll have to think about that one. I don't have a quick response to that. But I was taken, Kurt, with what you said, and actually I was trying to think about, because I didn't have teachers like that, how I was able to transcend that. I think it was my parents. I think that my parents were relatively open-minded compared to many other people. I remember that I had to have a letter from them that I took to the public library that said, give this kid any book he wants, because I was checking out this stuff that the librarians said, well, you know, you're like 12 years old, kid, you can't have this. And my parents were kind enough to give me a letter so I could say, yes, I can. And by the way, it's our tax dollars that are paying for your frickin' library, except I didn't use the F word. But I think in thinking about number 1 and number 2 of the 3 things that I brought up, and we haven't really talked about the third, but I think that one is perhaps even the most important of the 3. Maybe another show. There's a kind of premature closure of identity that seems to happen. Some of it maybe is externally imposed, because you want people, even from birth, as Huxley noted in Brave New World, to feel this is who I am, and don't question people who are above you somehow, because this is who you are. But even in countries where that isn't the case, many people seem to very early on decide this is who I am, and because this is who I am, anything that I encounter that's different is a threat, as opposed to saying my identity is still evolving, which I certainly feel, and I think probably all of us feel, is true even now. My identity is still evolving. I don't see something new as a threat, because my identity is still evolving. So how we kind of prevent premature closure of identity, I think, is one interesting way of thinking about this.
Chris, it doesn't surprise me that you're checking out high school and college level books as a 12-year-old, and it'd be interesting to find each of us at age 12 walking into the library and looking at the book selections that we had. In first grade, the teachers I had were really said, Kurt has a real problem reading and writing. So I had to prove them wrong. In second grade, I did 120 book reviews every day I was in the library. It was next door was the library on the way home from school, from Irving Elementary School. Chris might recognize, maybe not. But what high school did you go to, Chris?
Washington High School.
Washington. Okay. Yeah.
My library, Chris, was my father's noodle shop. So this was when I was growing up. In China at that time, in 1960s, Cultural Revolution, if you're in a remote village, there's really nothing available, really. Just you are not allowed to move either. But so most of my reading came really from, I traded, for example, I would wash sweet potatoes for a guy, the landlord's family. They had some old textbooks I would get to. And then my father set up a noodle shop where he would buy used, books and whatever to wrap the noodles so he can sell them. And they came mostly, the cover is gone, the back is gone. So I got ready to become a detective. I was making up most of the stories, and they were not rated. They can be science, they can be math, they can be history. And many of those books were banned by the Chinese government. So another thing is Chairman Mao's 5 volumes of Chairman Mao's works. And because my father was a communist member, he was given many copies of those books. I got to read them, but what interests me was Mao Zedong was a great historian. He cites a lot of stories, and I read the footnotes a lot. But most of my reading has just been unfiltered, nothing. That's why I'm kind of against books in this country to be graded. Oh, this is level 1, level 2. Why do you do that? If you can read level 10, read level 10, or you can get into guesses. It's a very different thing. But also I wonder, why didn't my neighbors' kids read? Why didn't my sisters read? Why didn't my younger brother's 10 years younger, why didn't he try to read that? So this is actually a question I want to raise to all of our educators to consider individual differences. Why did somebody do something? Like Chris did that, your parents, you went there, but the library is available to everybody. Why somebody do it? Why somebody don't do it? I think that's when our education's big challenge, individual differences, family differences. How do we help everybody to develop an interest in reading, in conversation, in interacting with others?
I'm listening to Thomas Edison's biography right now, and he did that. He checked out books that people thought were well beyond his level, but it enabled him to do things, his experiments in chemistry and electrical engineering and other areas, the inventions that unfolded over time, hundreds, if not over 1,000 actually, of patents, was because of his early reading and what he had access to, and what he spent all his wages, all his salary on the next books and the next experiments. He was always broke in his early days because he was constantly building up his repertoire of skills that he had. But what got him to that point? Not his brothers, not his sisters. What enabled him in his family life? Well, his mother was a huge supporter of his early growth and pushed him in his learning journeys. So everybody has their own individual stories of influences, like you say, individual differences. But it was partly his mother, and his father was very much a revolutionary or a libertarian that pushed his thinking as well. Punya's laughing, so I'm sure Punya's got a comment here.
No, I was just reminded of something that my dad used to say, because when he was in school, he a street magician came along. So this is India back in like 40s, right? So a street magician comes along, and this guy leaves and goes away with him for a year. That's my dad, right? Then he comes back, gets in a lot of trouble from his parents, and he's basically just tootling around in school, and he decides, somebody tells him that there are nice detective novels written in another language, Bengali. So he makes himself learn Bengali so that he can read detective stories. And he is in, I think, what would be the equivalent of 11th grade now, which is like junior college back then in India. And the professor asked him a question, and everybody in class started laughing. He's like, oh, this guy doesn't know anything. He just reads detective stories. And something the professor told him, and he would repeat this to me over and over again, was like, there is some pride in knowing something. There is no pride in knowing nothing. And to him, that was the transformational moment. That's why I was laughing. I was just reminded of the story of my dad. It was like out of the blue.
So did you say your father followed the magician, disappeared for a year?
Yeah, for
a year?
Yeah.
Well, we're waiting for you to do that, Punya, someday.
Yeah,
but that's actually
a police
amazing.
officer at the end of the day, in the Indian police service. So, who's to say? I know.
But that's an amazing story, right? He disappeared, and that's okay. That's great. Chris, you have a comment?
Well, just that curiosity is a common theme that I'm hearing. And kids, everybody is born curious. Now, you may have curiosity taken away from you very, very early by your family or by outside influences. But everybody is born curious, and people who are able to keep that burning, passionate sense of curiosity are going to have a lot of the desirable attributes in my first two questions.
So thank you for bringing that word up, Kurt, because I had exactly the same sort of perspective around curiosity that you just said. Recently, I had a chance to speak with, I'm forgetting the name of the gentleman, the blog post is here, Schooler, and he brought to my attention that there are two kinds of curiosity. And there is sort of the deficit curiosity, and there is what they call the growth curiosity. I don't remember the exact term. I have to look up my own blog post. But in one case, it's very strong. It's just this urge to fill this gap, not an urge to grow. And if you have the urge to just fill your gap, that's typically the people who are falling into fake news stories, who are spreading misinformation. So that there is a darker side to curiosity, which was, I think, very interesting for me to learn that psychologically that there are these two dimensions. Because I used to always wonder about this, like when you listen to an anti-vaxxer, like, go do the research. I did the research. So clearly they have put in some effort into finding something out, but why have they reached a completely different conclusion? Because that effort to find something out is a way of papering over that gap, not genuinely trying to understand and recognize that can actually lead to more questions, And so that distinction, that was a very important one. And I sort of wrote this blog post that I just shared here just a few weeks back. But it helped me understand that difference, because I hear a lot of people say this, right? They say, oh, I did the research. And then how come we are in completely opposing ends of the spectrum? And it's for what purpose that research was done and what the nature of curiosity that drove it, I think, is a very important one. So yes to curiosity, but more nuance, I think, there.
You don't go to the Ministry of Truth to do your research.
All right, thank you, guys. We are coming toward the end. This is very exciting, actually. It's it's a depressing time, but it's inspiring conversation. I think Rainey suggests education needs to be a much more than teaching so-called traditional reading skills and math skills. There's a lot more. Okay, I hope you guys have learned a lot where to find banned books, 5 rupees on the streets, or in my father's noodle shop, where he didn't really, he had wrapped noodles, quick.
So speaking of noodle shops and wrapping of food and selling it, right now there is a person in India who has been imprisoned because he's a Muslim man who was allegedly selling chicken wrapped in newspapers which had Hindu gods' names on it.
Ooh, Sounds like China many years ago. But anyway, so let me introduce you to next episode. Next episode actually is quite interesting. Chris Diddy first alerted me to this article published in the Heckner report. It's called How in Oakland, California addressed its digital divide issue. Really, in essence, provided access to devices and internet connectivity to all families, of students, which is shocking, amazing. First of all, I was shocked, Oakland would be such a poor place. It's neighboring, Berkeley, just it's in the Bay Area. You would have so many families who did not have access. And then the approach they took to make it happen was also very shocking and amazing. And so I reached out to the reporter from Heckner report and two people from Oakland in the mayor's office, and they used to work on this project, and they're still sustaining this project for next episode. We'll just be talking about the digital divide and what to do with it. That would also include, I think, hopefully some global perspectives. So welcome to our next episode.